When was the scientific consensus on climate change established, and how was it established? The rest of this lecture will address these two questions. We will start with the first question. We touched on the history of climate change research in the last lecture, but this was the work of individual scientists or small groups of scientists. This does not represent consensus. To build a scientific consensus, we need a significant number of scientists working on the problem, making measurements, developing conceptual and mathematical models, verifying each other's work. You will recall from the last lecture that the first mathematical model to predict the effect on global temperature of increasing carbon dioxide was due to Svante Arrhenius. This had built upon the conceptual work of Joseph Fourier and the experimental analysis of John Tyndall and Eunice Foote. Arrhenius wasn't concerned about his predictions, perhaps because he was Swedish. He viewed the increased temperatures as being a good thing. Concern about global warming was first voiced by Guy Callendar. By 1938, Callendar was convinced that nearly all carbon dioxide produced by fossil fuel combustion had remained in the atmosphere, and suggested that the increase in carbon dioxide may account for the observed slight rise of average temperature in northern latitudes in the previous 50 years. With war breaking out in Europe, Callendar wasn't able to continue his research, and little further work was done for some 20 years. One reason why others didn't continue the work of Callendar even after the war is because there was an important uncertainty around water vapour. Scientists at the time agreed that carbon dioxide was a greenhouse gas, and that if you increased atmospheric concentrations, it might affect the climate. But they argued that water vapour is a greenhouse gas, and that there is so much more water vapour than carbon dioxide. Scientists were sceptical that small increases in carbon dioxide could have a big effect. This scepticism is still present today in the arguments proffered by many climate change deniers. However, we can answer this scepticism using a figure we presented in the last lecture. This figure shows the atmospheric absorption due to different gases. You can see that water vapour and carbon dioxide do not absorb at the same wavelengths. Importantly, there are wavelengths at which water vapour absorbs very little, but carbon dioxide absorbs greatly. Increases in carbon dioxide will thus significantly increase the absorption of infrared radiation at these wavelengths, and ultimately affect Earth's surface temperatures. So water vapour will not overwhelm the absorption due to carbon dioxide. Among the first to recognise that there was a need to return to the work of Callendar were Roger Revelle and Hans Suess. In 1957, they published an influential paper that recognised the importance of studying the Callendar effect, but further recognised the inadequacy of current data. They stated that present data on the total amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, on the rates and mechanisms of exchange, are inadequate for accurate measurement of future changes in atmospheric CO2. They pushed for such measurements to be an integral part of the scientific project for the International Geophysical Year. The International Geophysical Year, that lasted from the 1st of July 1957 until the end of 1958, was crucial in bringing together scientists from across the globe to study many issues of geophysical concern, including climate change. It was as part of the International Geophysical Year that Charles Keeling received the funding, pushed for by Revelle and Suess, to measure carbon dioxide at Mauna Loa in Hawaii. The results from Mauna Loa, now referred to as the Keeling curve, showed that instruments had the sensitivity to measure accurately small changes in the CO2 concentrations of the atmosphere. Keeling's data showed that between 1958 and 1965, CO2 concentrations had risen by some 1%, or 3 parts per million by volume, or ppmv. These data were greatly concerning to the scientific community. Revelle and Keeling were asked to chair the President's Science Advisory Committee that published the report Restoring the Quality of Our Environment that we mentioned in the last lecture. In that report, the authors warned that by the year 2000 there will be about 25% more CO2 in our atmosphere than at present, and that this will modify the heat balance of the atmosphere to such an extent that marked changes in climate could occur. Responding to this report, President Lyndon Johnson declared in a special message to the US Congress, again in 1965, that this generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. Here, the US President was reporting the scientific consensus from his Science Advisory Committee. This is one of the important roles that scientific consensus plays in society. It helps to inform public policy. And indeed, in the 1970s in the US, the impact of rising carbon dioxide on climate was informing national policy in terms of energy, national security, and the economy. By the end of the 1970s, in an evaluation of the evidence for CO2-induced climate change, the National Academy of Sciences, the premier science academy in the US, whose membership is considered one of the highest professional honours, released a report that stated, "A plethora of studies from diverse sources indicates a consensus that climate changes will result from man's combustion of fossil fuels and changes in land use, the latter primarily due to deforestation and changes in agricultural practice." This was an early description of the state of our understanding of climate change and described this understanding as being the consensus of scientists working in this field. This was a consensus not just of the conceptual understanding by which carbon dioxide influences Earth's surface temperature, but it was a consensus of expectation that if we continue to burn fossil fuels, then climate change, including increased Earth's surface temperatures, will result. So have we identified when the scientific consensus on climate change was established? Well, yes and no. Yes, we had established a consensus that burning fossil fuels will lead to climate change. But no, in the sense that there was not a consensus about when this climate change will happen. Identifying this timeline would be crucial and indeed controversial. Thanks for listening.